guys, it's me Whitney from All the Shelves. I am way behind in doing this video. It is now July 17th and I am going to be filming my June wrap up, and I also didn't do a two-part wrap up in June, so I just have a whole ton of books to talk about. But honestly, I had a busy week and that's all the excuse I need because this is my channel. I can do what I want. So yeah, here are the books that I read in June. The first thing I read was a total dud and it took me forever to read, which is why I didn't do a two-parter in June, and it was Joe Hill's The Fireman. And I had such high hopes for this because I loved Nosferatu and I loved his collections of short stories. I think it was called like 20th Century Ghosts or something like that. So I thought, like, I am on board for this author. But The Fireman was over 700 pages and it felt like Joe Hill's version of The Stand, which I also didn't love, not as much as I didn't like this, but The Stand as a teenager really bothered me because the men and the women like immediately fall into very traditional gender roles as soon as like the apocalypse happens, and I know that that's a kind of a dumb reason to dislike a book, but I remember giving it like 1 star at the time and just being really annoyed with that. And The Fireman kind of corrects those mistakes. I don't know if it's like a conscious correction, but the story is about a society in the near future that gets this disease called dragon scale, and this one woman gets the disease, and her boyfriend or husband, I can't remember which, they had decided that if they got the disease they would kill themselves, but she gets the disease right after finding out that she is pregnant, or right before, or something like that. And so she decides that she doesn't want to kill herself, and the story goes on from there. There's a lot in common with The Stand in that there is like a smaller community that is trying to live out the last days in the ways that they know how, which is by like forming, you know, relationships and connections with each other. And it's about the human tendency to want to grab onto as much power as possible in those circumstances, in the name of like helping people or in the name of community. So I mean, parts of that are really interesting, and I do like that this female protagonist ends up making a whole lot of choices for herself and being the sort of center of the novel, but it goes on and on. And I actually really liked the community building scenes, but I really hated the action in this book. There was something about how he described action that just felt very repetitive, and it felt like it would never end, and it went over like so many chapters and it just wasn't exciting to me. There's something that Joe Hill does that's kind of annoying to me, in that he talks about pain constantly. So if somebody like breaks their leg or something, then every other sentence needs to be about the pain in their leg, which like is effective in some ways but also really repetitive and annoying in others. The other thing that he does in this book is make a ton of popular culture references that are going to be dated within a year. I thought it was a really interesting choice to do that, because if you're talking about a like society in the near future, then it loses its potency as soon as those references aren't applicable anymore. So that was very strange. Anyway, I wasn't really a fan of the story, I wasn't really a fan of the writing in this one, but I will definitely keep reading Joe Hill just because Nosferatu was so cool to me and had so many images that just stuck with me. Even if the writing wasn't like fantastic, it was still, you know, genre writing. I just really enjoyed that book. So I'll keep reading Joe Hill. The Fireman was a thumbs down for me. The next book that I read was As I Lay Dying. I did this as a buddy read with Kate Howe and Stephanie from That's What She Read, and I filmed a whole video on it. I think it's like a 12-minute review, so I'm not going to be talking about it anymore here, just that I loved it. And if you want to hear what I thought about As I Lay Dying and you haven't yet, there will be a link that you can click on. In June, I finally finished the Little House series. So this was These Happy Golden Years and The First 4 Years. And again, I'm going to do a big comprehensive review on all of the Little House books because I feel like I have some things to say that don't quite fit into these wrap-up videos. But in short, I didn't love either of these two books. These Happy Golden Years it was really depressing in a way that I don't think she intended, or maybe she did. I need to learn more about Laura Ingalls Wilder, but the way that she describes her relationship to her husband and like their courtship and her becoming a wife was just like distressing to me. It seemed traumatic, and it seemed like it was like giving up her autonomy, and I'm curious about whether or not that was intentional. And then the first 4 years is a little bit different than the other books because it was published posthumously, and it was published from like drafts, and you can definitely tell that there was a different audience in mind. So I'm not sure why they packaged those with the little house books. The writing quality just isn't there, and I'm sure had she had time to do more drafts it would be. So yeah, those are those two. Another book that I read for a buddy read this month was The Beekeepers Apprentice by Lori R. King. I remember Sarai was reading this, and Kate Howe was also reading this, but I was actually the only one who ended up finishing it. It's part of the Mary Russell series, which is a kind of like fan fiction series about Sherlock Holmes. So it's like Sherlock in his older years meets this younger girl. She's like 15 when he first meets her, and it kind of like teaches her how to be a detective, and she is also a genius and kind of like a curmudgeon like he is, a little bit Asperger's-y, you know, and there were a few things that we didn't like about the book. One was that they just put John Watson aside, which that relationship between Sherlock and John Watson, while it has been like really expanded upon from the original stories, it's still central to those stories, and I think that it's been expanded upon like in the BBC series because it's something human that people can really grasp onto in these very analytical, rational stories. And so to just push it aside and to just say, John Watson, that bumbling idiot, it did not work for any of us. It seems like Lori King was trying to replace John Watson with Mary Russell and to insert some of that like romantic ambiguity there between the two of them, between Sherlock and Mary rather than between Sherlock and John, and so she didn't want it to have like a kind of triangle of relationships, but we all reacted to that very negatively. The other thing that we didn't love about this book was that the first half is really episodic, and it didn't feel like it was all going to lead to a more central mystery, which like we didn't really want to read a book of collected short stories. It does lead to a central mystery, but it takes a long time to get there. Now, I finished it because I thought it was pretty okay. I thought the writing style was really pleasant. There was something very comforting about reading it, but I didn't love this book. Still, weirdly, I kind of want to continue with the series just to see how it goes when the introductions are out of the way, so we'll see if I do that. As I said in my Q&A video, I am preparing to try teaching high school next year. I'm moving from teaching college to teaching high school, and so I'm reading a bunch of stuff that is on the 10th grade curriculum, like the books that my school has access to, and so the first one I read of those was To Kill a Mockingbird. I have so many things to say about this book, and I also really am careful when I talk about this book because I'll just say right up front, I don't really like it very much, and I know that it is very dear to a lot of people's hearts, and I don't necessarily want to like rip apart something that people hold so dear. Like, I know people who have named their kids Atticus, and I don't want to tell them like, oh, you actually named your kid after a racist character, you know, like it seems like, what's the point sometimes? But I do want to say that I think that this book is meant for children. I don't think that this is a complex study of race, even if it is a kind of complex coming-of-age story. And I think that it's a problem when we start and end our discussion of race in high school with a book like To Kill a Mockingbird written by a white woman. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and this book is, to use like a annoying social justice graduate school word, I think it's very problematic. So it's going to be weird teaching this. I'm actually required to teach To Kill a Mockingbird, and we're going to do it from a very critical lens, and we'll see how the 10th graders respond to that. I don't know if they'll be very happy with me. Another book on that 10th grade curriculum list is Animal Farm by George Orwell, so I reread this. This works as an allegory, and I think as an allegory it's fascinating. So if I were to teach this one, I would do it in terms of rhetoric and resemblance claims. As a work of literature, not so much. And I don't think it was intended for that. Like, I think Orwell intended this to be an argument, not necessarily like, you know, a great narrative. But there are some like really great things going on in the book that I remember really responding to at that age. I didn't learn this one in school, but I read it on my own outside of school. And I remember being able to compare, you know, the political figures that I found fascistic or dictator-esque or whatever to what he was talking about in Animal Farm, and I found that really satisfying. So I think that in an election year, and especially when we have a figure, a caricature like Trump running for president, teaching Animal Farm might be really interesting. And the other book that I read for that was Night by Elie Wiesel, and this is another one that I don't want to break anybody's hearts, but I don't think it is the greatest book ever written. I don't think it's the greatest book about the Holocaust ever written, but how do you possibly tear apart someone's memoir about the Holocaust? Like, that's a stupid and unwise and offensive thing to do. I'm not saying that the book as a record is no good. It's obviously an amazing record of someone's experience, but you have to, I think you have to teach it as a memoir, and as like a memory and as a personal experience rather than as like a great work of art. And I think that the best way to go with this is to pair it with other Elie Wiesel works, which I think are very much stronger than this one, his first, and it makes a lot of sense that they would be stronger. I read it actually like a week before he died, which was like a really big coincidence. He was a very important and influential man, and I'm glad I got a chance to reread this book because I haven't read it since the 8th grade. Another book that I read in June was Almost Famous Women by Megan Mayhew Bergman. I read her collection, Birds of a Lesser Paradise, which I just adored. I think everything in that collection is really strong, and some of the stories in that have really stuck with me, which is saying a lot because short stories just go in one ear and out the other. I feel like in one eye and out the other. What is it when you're reading? So this one, Almost Famous Women, she takes all of these stories of women from like turn of the century up until like the 40s, it seems like, and these are women that haven't really had their place in history, and she kind of like fictionalizes their lives based on the things that we know about them. So there was one about Beryl Markham, which is that pilot that I talked about forever ago. Her memoir, West with the Night, is like so good, and she has a little story about her. There was a story about a woman who was the fastest woman on the water, so it was like a racing boat woman. I forgot her name. And there were like a whole bunch of stories like that that were fascinating. Edna St. Vincent Millay's sister gets a story, so it's these sort of like tangential women that have been pushed to the side but have like fascinating lives. I didn't think every story in the book was quite as memorable as Birds of a Lesser Paradise, that collection, but there were some that really stood out and were wonderful. Another really excellent book that I read this month was The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I had never read this. It was a huge hole in my literary knowledge, and actually this summer I've been really trying to fill those holes. Anyway, The Grapes of Wrath is just a story about Okies escaping the Dust Bowl and traveling by car to California. So the first 2/3 of the book, maybe just half, is a road trip kind of novel, and then they get to California with all their hopes, and those hopes are just dashed. I mean, we know the story from history. These aren't spoilers. So I talked about this more in my video on 1930s lit. It was from 1935 to 1939, that video, and I will link that if you want to hear more about it, because I don't want to go on and on. But The Grapes of Wrath was incredible. It's the best Steinbeck I've read, and I always like Steinbeck, but I always am curious if I had been alive and reading when Steinbeck was popular, if I would respond as much to him. Like, some of the legitimacy that Steinbeck has, I feel like comes from him being a classic writer, and if he were writing now, I wonder if we would just see him as popular. It's a really interesting question to me, because some of his stuff is like really popular style writing, like East of Eden, which I really love, and it's a fun book to read. But yeah, I wonder what my response would be. But I do think that Grapes of Wrath is an amazing book whenever you read it. I did read like a teachery textbook, so I don't know if you're interested in this, but it's called Teach Like a Champion 2.0. Apparently it's like the Bible of teaching, and I gotta say that this was one of the more discouraging things that I've ever read, while it was also uber helpful. So I got tons of information about how to control a classroom and how to like assert myself and how to have effective activities and that kind of stuff. But it did feel like 80% of teaching high school is coming up with acronyms, and 15% is classroom management, and then 5% is decorating your classroom. Like, it didn't feel like you have to know the subject at all to be an effective high school teacher, which maybe is true, but that's such a depressing thought. Yeah, I don't think it's true. Obviously, you need to love your subject and know a lot about it. And all of the English teachers that I've met so far, at least at my school, know a lot about their subject and are really smart people. But these kinds of books that are about classroom management and about coming up with these little tricks obviously can't get into that. As a new teacher, it's like, I feel like it might be an essential read, but also one that you need to keep some distance from, so that you know, like, you do not have to adopt these attitudes or these practices in your classroom. But, you know, I haven't taught yet, so we'll see how it goes. And the last thing that I read in June that I will talk about in this video was The Taming of the Shrew. I am trying to read a whole bunch of Shakespeare this summer. I've kind of slowed down as the summer has gone on, but The Taming of the Shrew is an interesting play. I want to see it as satirical. I really want to see that last speech that Kate gives as being ironic. This is the speech when she's saying, like, women need to just, like, sort of bow down before their husbands because their husbands give them so much. But I don't know that I can. I went and saw a production of it last summer. The production was wonderful. One, because they cast, like, a really handsome guy as Petruchio. It was kind of a Streetcar Named Desire situation where, like, the lead guy is, like, abusive but also so hot, and you're wondering if his masculine, like, abusiveness is playing into why he's so hot, and it makes you really uncomfortable. It was one of those situations. The play was great. They did not play the last speech as ironic, and I felt like that was kind of being true to the spirit of the play. I think that it's really cool, though, that it's ambiguous, or at least that it has the potential to be ambiguous, and that certain productions have kind of taken liberties, I would say, and made it more of a feminist text. But as I read it, it's not. But I don't know. I need to study this one a little bit more. So those were all the books that I read in June. There were a whole lot of them. Let me know what your experience with these books have been. Sorry I haven't been as good at responding to comments this week. Like I said, it's been a week, man. But I'm back on it, and let's talk down below, and I'll see you later.